My name is Emily. I am 33 years old and a forensic accountant who spends her days uncovering corporate financial fraud. I never imagined the most devastating fraud of my life would be hiding inside my own body. I was lying on a cold examination table for my 12-week ultrasound when the substitute doctor suddenly stopped moving the wand. She stared at her encrypted monitor, her face draining of color. She locked the clinic door, pulled me aside, and whispered that I needed to leave my husband immediately. I asked her why. She told me there was no time to explain, but that what she found in my medical file would make my blood boil. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever discovered a betrayal hiding in plain sight. Getting to that examination table had been a grueling and expensive journey. For 3 long years, my husband Richard and I had poured our hearts and our savings into expanding our family. Richard was 35, charming, and worked as an executive consultant. He always handled the administrative side of our lives. When my career demanded 80-hour work weeks during tax and audit seasons, Richard volunteered to manage all the complex paperwork, insurance claims, and legal documents for our fertility treatments. I thought I was the luckiest woman alive to have such a supportive partner who wanted to take the burden off my shoulders. We chose the Genesis Elite Fertility Center, a highly exclusive clinic in downtown Chicago, known for its flawless success rates, cutting-edge genetic tracking, and ironclad discretion. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when everything shattered. I took a rare morning off from a massive corporate embezzlement case to attend my 12-week checkup. Richard had a sudden emergency meeting and could not make it. He kissed my forehead at the door, telling me to bring home the first clear pictures of our baby. I walked into the pristine, brightly lit lobby of the clinic, feeling nothing but pure joy and anticipation. The receptionist handed me a clipboard with routine updates, which I signed without a second thought. My regular fertility specialist was attending a medical conference in Seattle. Instead, I was assigned to Dr. Thorne, a sharp and meticulous professional who had recently transferred from a prestigious hospital in Boston. Dr. Thorne led me into examination room 4. The air conditioning was freezing, raising goosebumps on my arms as I changed into the paper gown. She reviewed my extensive chart on her secure tablet, asking standard questions about my diet, my stress levels, and my prenatal vitamins. Everything felt completely normal. She dimmed the overhead lights, applied the warm gel to my stomach, and began the ultrasound. The rhythmic, rapid sound of a tiny heartbeat filled the quiet room. Tears of relief pricked the corners of my eyes. After years of negative tests and heartbreak, I was finally going to be a mother. But the moment of pure joy evaporated in an instant. Dr. Thorne tapped the screen of her machine, zooming in on a specialized alphanumeric barcode that was digitally embedded in my file. Genesis Elite used a proprietary fail-safe tracking system for all their in vitro fertilization procedures to guarantee absolute genetic matches. As a forensic accountant, my entire career was built on noticing tiny numerical discrepancies, but I had no access to this encrypted medical database. I watched Dr. Thorne narrow her eyes at the screen. She typed a command into her keyboard. A flashing red warning banner appeared across her secondary monitor. She typed another sequence, her fingers moving frantically. Her breathing hitched. The soft hum of the ultrasound machine suddenly felt deafening as the heavy silence dragged on. Dr. Thorne abruptly pulled the wand away and wiped the gel from my stomach with trembling hands. She did not say a single word as she walked straight over to the heavy oak door of the examination room and slid the deadbolt into place. The loud click echoed off the sterile walls like a gunshot. She turned back to me, her professional medical composure completely shattered. She pulled a chair close to the edge of the examination table, leaned in, and lowered her voice to an urgent, terrified whisper. She told me to listen carefully and not to panic. She said there was a catastrophic discrepancy in the genetic barcode of the embryo they had implanted in my uterus. She urged me to gather my things, walk out of the clinic, and hire a ruthless divorce attorney the moment I got to my car. I sat up, clutching the thin paper gown to my chest. my analytical mind racing to process her words. I demanded to know what was wrong with my baby. Dr. Thorne turned the monitor to face me, pointing to the genetic source file, and my entire world collapsed. I stared at the glowing lines of data on the monitor. Dr. Thorne pointed a shaking finger at the maternal source codes. She explained that the alphanumeric string assigned to the implanted embryo had been flagged by the system overnight during a routine database sweep. It did not match the biological profile I had submitted during my initial blood work. I felt the paper gown crinkle under my gripping hands. I asked her point blank, whose DNA was currently growing inside me. Dr. Thorne hesitated for a fraction of a second before pulling up the cross-referenced database. The paternal donor was confirmed as my husband, Richard. The maternal donor profile had been imported from a separate VIP account within the clinic network. Dr. Thorne highlighted the patient name on the screen. It read, Audrey, my 31-year-old younger sister. My lungs completely stopped working. The sterile air in the room felt thick and unbreathable. Audrey was the golden child of our family. She was a former catalog model who married rich and always got exactly what she wanted, exactly when she wanted it. A sickening memory flashed through my mind. Just a few months ago, Audrey had visited my house under the guise of checking on my fertility treatments. We had sat in my kitchen and she casually complained that she and her husband wanted a baby soon, but she could not stomach the idea of ruining her perfect figure or dealing with the physical toll of pregnancy. I had rolled my eyes, thinking it was just her usual self-centered vanity. I never imagined it was a calculated reconnaissance mission. The shock began to recede rapidly, replaced by the cold, analytical instincts of my profession. As a forensic accountant, I track lies for a living. I trace hidden assets, forged documents, and corporate deceit. My brain instantly shifted from victim to investigator. I looked at Dr. Thorne and told her to open the legal consent files. A clinic like Genesis Elite requires ironclad legal documentation, notarized physical documents, and multi-step verifications for third-party genetic material transfers. I demanded to see the authorization forms that allowed this procedure to happen. Dr. Thorne clicked into the administrative folder. A digital copy of a gestational surrogate consent agreement appeared on the secondary monitor. I leaned in close. There at the bottom of the final page was my signature. I stared at the blue ink on the screen. It was not mine. The loop on the letter Y in my name was too perfectly rounded. The slant was entirely wrong. The pressure points on the digital scan indicated someone drawing the name, not signing it naturally. It was a masterful forgery executed by someone who had watched me sign thousands of tax documents and legal audits over the last 10 years. The puzzle pieces slammed together with terrifying clarity. Richard, the incredibly supportive, caring husband who insisted on handling all the clinic paperwork while I was drowning in the middle of corporate tax season. He had offered to attend the private administrative consultations when I was tied up in board meetings. He had been the one intercepting the courier deliveries containing our legal documents. He had orchestrated this entire nightmare right under my nose, weaponizing my own crushing work schedule against me. They had turned my body into an unwitting incubator. Richard and Audrey had bypassed federal medical regulations, bypassed standard ethics, and completely stripped me of my bodily autonomy. They did it all to harvest a child without Audrey having to stretch a single muscle or gain a single pound. Richard had likely exploited a blind spot in the clinic administration, slipping the forged surrogacy agreement into my massive stack of routine insurance paperwork. Dr. Thorne reached for the landline on the wall. She offered to call the Chicago Police Department immediately. She stated clearly that this constituted severe medical battery and federal fraud. But as I looked at that forged signature, the tears that had been burning the corners of my eyes completely dried up. A freezing, absolute fury settled deep into my bones. Calling the police right now would be a tactical error. If I blew the whistle today, Richard would instantly drain our joint accounts and hire expensive defense lawyers. My family would immediately rally around Audrey, spinning a web of lies to protect their golden child. They would find a way to make me look unstable or worse, claim I knew about the surrogacy arrangement all along and simply changed my mind. I needed undeniable bulletproof evidence before I burned their lives to the ground. I told Dr. Thorne to put the phone down. I explained that an immediate police presence would give Richard the one thing he did not deserve, which was a warning. I needed the paper trail secured before he could log into the patient portal and attempt to delete or alter the administrative history. I instructed her to print every single document related to my IVF cycle. I wanted the genetic barcodes, the chain of custody logs, the billing statements, and a high-resolution copy of that forged surrogacy agreement. Dr. Thorne nodded, her professional demeanor returning, as she recognized the cold, unyielding authority in my voice. She went to the secure terminal and began printing. I watched the thick stack of papers slide out of the machine, each page documenting a felony. I asked her to sign and date every single page with her official medical stamp legally certifying the records. When she finally handed me the heavy manila folder, it felt like holding a loaded weapon. I changed out of the paper gown and put my tailored work suit back on, meticulously smoothing out every wrinkle. I checked my reflection in the small mirror above the sink. My eyes were completely dry. My hands were perfectly steady. I walked out of examination room 4, down the brightly lit, pristine hallway, and past the smiling front desk receptionist, who had absolutely no idea she was currently guarding a crime scene. The rainy Tuesday morning had transitioned into a bleak, freezing afternoon. The icy wind hit my face as I walked across the wet asphalt of the parking lot to my car. I got into the driver's seat, closed the heavy door, and let the absolute suffocating silence of the cabin wash over me. I placed the certified medical file on the passenger seat. It was the complete, undeniable audit of my husband's ultimate betrayal. For 10 straight minutes I just sat there gripping the leather steering wheel. As a forensic accountant, I knew that the absolute key to destroying a fraudster was to let them believe they were getting away with their crime. Fraudsters get incredibly sloppy when they feel victorious. Richard thought he had successfully manipulated a high-end medical facility and trapped me into legally incubating his child with my own sister. He thought my demanding 80-hour work weeks made me a distracted and easy target. But he forgot one crucial detail. He forgot that my entire career was literally built on dismantling arrogant men who thought they could hide their dirty, destructive secrets in the fine print. I was not going to give him the satisfaction of dealing with a screaming, hysterical wife. I was going to give him a calculated financial and legal execution. My thoughts were abruptly interrupted by the sharp buzz of my phone vibrating in the cup holder. The screen lit up with a text message from my mother, Diana. I picked it up and swiped to open the notification. The message read, "Family dinner tonight at 7. Do not be late. Audrey and Andre have huge news to share with everyone." I stared at the glowing words on the screen for a long time. A dark, hollow laugh escaped my chest and echoed in the quiet car. The timing was entirely too perfect. The sick, twisted game they were playing was suddenly crystal clear. Audrey was going to use this dinner to announce that she and Andre were finally expecting a baby via an anonymous surrogate. They were going to celebrate the child currently growing in my womb while smiling right to my face. My mind immediately went to my brother-in-law, Andre. He was a brilliant, highly successful architect who ran a massive commercial firm. He worked grueling hours and was a genuinely good man who deeply loved my sister. It was glaringly obvious now that Richard and Audrey were playing him just as heavily as they were playing me. They were undoubtedly draining his business bank accounts to fund this illicit medical nightmare under the guise of exorbitant VIP surrogacy fees. My mother was absolutely in on the secret given her lifelong historical obsession with protecting Audrey from any physical discomfort or inconvenience. I looked over at the manila folder resting on the passenger seat. I could drive home right now, throw the papers in Richard's face, and blow up my marriage today. But that would be a complete waste of perfectly good leverage. I picked up my phone and replied to my mother, telling her I would not miss it for the world. Then I started the engine. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the clinic parking lot. I was going to that family dinner and I was bringing a lethal secret to the table. The drive to my parents' house in the affluent suburbs of Oak Brook took exactly 45 minutes. I used every single second of that commute to lock my emotions into a steel vault. When I pulled into the sweeping circular driveway, my headlights illuminated the massive brick colonial home that had always been a monument to my mother's obsession with appearances. The front lawn was flawlessly manicured, and the massive bay windows glowed with warm, inviting light. It looked like the perfect American family home. But as I stepped out of my car and felt the freezing night air hit my face, I knew it was nothing more than a beautifully decorated crime scene. I grabbed my purse, leaving the certified medical file securely locked in the trunk, and walked up the front steps. I pushed open the heavy mahogany front door and was instantly hit by the smell of catered prime rib and expensive red wine. From the living room, I could hear the sound of clinking glasses and laughter. I walked into the room and immediately saw my husband, Richard. He was standing by the fireplace holding a glass of scotch and laughing at something my brother-in-law, Andre, was saying. Richard looked immaculate in his tailored suit, playing the role of the devoted, hard-working husband to absolute perfection. When he saw me, his face lit up with a practiced, loving smile. He walked over, wrapped his arm around my waist, and kissed my cheek, asking how the ultrasound went and apologizing profusely for missing it. I did not flinch. I looked him dead in the eyes, smiled a perfectly hollow smile, and told him the doctor said everything was progressing exactly as it should. Across the room, Audrey was lounging on the custom white leather sofa like a queen holding court. She was wearing a stunning form-fitting designer dress that highlighted her slender, model-thin figure. My mother, Diana, was hovering over her, offering her a plate of imported cheeses and acting as if Audrey had just cured a major disease. Andre, standing tall and imposing with his kind, tired eyes, walked over to greet me. He gave me a warm hug and asked about my week. Andre was a 34-year-old architectural genius who had built a massively successful commercial design firm from the ground up. He was a genuinely good, incredibly hardworking man. Looking at him, my stomach twisted. He was funding this entire sickening charade, completely unaware that the man drinking his scotch and the woman sitting on the sofa were systematically destroying his life. My mother clapped her hands loudly, announcing that dinner was served. We moved into the formal dining room, taking our seats beneath the glittering crystal chandelier. The table was set with fine china and polished silver. Diana immediately steered the conversation toward Audrey, praising her recent charity gala appearance and her flawless fashion sense. I sat quietly, cutting into my food, hyper-aware of the tiny, stolen life currently growing inside my own body. I watched Richard and Audrey exchange subtle, secret glances across the table. They were so confident in their deception, so arrogantly certain that I was just a clueless, overworked workaholic who would blindly carry their burden. About halfway through the meal, Audrey set her silver fork down and gracefully stood up from her chair. She picked up her crystal wine glass and tapped it lightly with a spoon. The clear, sharp ringing sound brought the entire table to a dead silence. She looked around the room, her eyes gleaming with a theatrical mix of excitement and vulnerability. She reached down and took Andre by the hand, pulling him up to stand next to her. Andre looked at her with pure, unfiltered adoration. Audrey took a deep breath and dramatically announced that after months of private discussions and careful planning, she and Andre were finally expanding their family. She paused, letting my mother gasp in delight before adding the sickening twist. She explained that due to the extreme physical demands of her lifestyle and her deep concerns about the permanent damage pregnancy causes to a woman's body, they had hired a highly exclusive, completely anonymous surrogate to carry their child. She spoke about this anonymous woman with a tone of overwhelming pity and condescension, praising the surrogate as a brave vessel doing the difficult, messy work that Audrey herself simply could not be bothered to endure. The room erupted into applause and celebration. My mother jumped out of her chair, rushing over to pull Audrey into a tearful embrace. Andre kissed his wife on the forehead, his face radiating genuine pride and joy for their future. I turned my head slowly and looked directly at Richard. He raised his glass of expensive red wine, a faint, incredibly arrogant smirk playing on his lips, and took a slow sip. He was toasting his own grotesque victory. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, letting the applause wash over me, while the trap in my mind snapped firmly shut. As the applause finally began to die down, my mother wiped a theatrical tear from her cheek and turned her sharp, glittering eyes directly toward me. The warmth in the room seemed to instantly evaporate, replaced by the familiar suffocating pressure of her judgment. Diana never missed an opportunity to elevate Audrey by stepping on my neck, and tonight was going to be her masterpiece. She reached across the table, picked up her wine glass, and gestured toward me with a look of overwhelming pity that made my skin crawl. She told me that I should really pay attention to how my sister handles her life. Her voice carried across the silent dining room, loud and intentionally piercing. She said that Audrey understood the value of working smart, not just working hard. Then, with a chillingly casual tone, she weaponized the most painful years of my life. She stated that Audrey knew exactly how to give her husband an heir without destroying her body or wasting years on failed IVF attempts. She actually looked me up and down, her lip curling slightly, and told me I should take notes instead of burying myself in corporate audits while my biological clock expired. The sheer cruelty of her words hung in the air like a physical weight. I had spent the last 3 years injecting myself with hormones, enduring endless medical procedures, and crying in clinic bathrooms, all while billing 80-hour weeks to keep our finances afloat. My mother knew every single detail of that agonizing journey, and yet she was perfectly willing to reduce all my suffering to a punchline just to make Audrey shine a little brighter. I glanced across the table at Andre. The bright, joyful smile had completely vanished from his face, replaced by a deep, uncomfortable frown. He shifted in his chair, clearly disturbed by the viciousness of my mother's attack. Andre was an only child who had lost his own parents early in life. He had always craved the warmth of a big family, which was exactly why he tolerated the constant underlying toxicity of mine. But he was a genuinely good man, and I could see the conflict raging in his eyes. He reached out and gently squeezed Audrey's arm, his voice low and firm, as he tried to de-escalate the situation. He told my mother that there was absolutely no need for comparisons. He said that every woman's journey to motherhood was deeply personal and valid, and that he and Audrey were just incredibly grateful for their surrogate. Audrey simply batted her eyelashes, feigning innocence. She placed her hand over her heart and let out a soft, condescending sigh. She told Andre that our mother did not mean any harm, she was just being practical. Audrey looked right at me with a sickeningly sweet smile and said she just wanted me to be as happy as she was. She suggested that maybe if I stopped stressing over other people's money and focused on my marriage, my body would finally relax enough to carry a child. My hands were tightly folded in my lap, my nails digging so hard into my palms that they were almost drawing blood. The absolute audacity of her statement was staggering. She was sitting there wearing designer silk, pretending to be a paragon of maternal wisdom, while her stolen biological child was currently growing inside my womb. Then the final twist of the knife came from the man sitting to my left. Richard let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and reached over to place his hand on top of mine. He stroked my knuckles, playing the part of the weary but devoted husband to absolute perfection. He looked across the table at my mother and Audrey, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. He asked them to please drop the subject. He said that Emily was trying her absolute best, and that my demanding career was just my way of coping with our fertility struggles. He actually looked at Andre and smiled, saying that not everyone could be as blessed as they were, and that we just had to play the hand we were dealt. I stared at Richard's hand resting on mine. I could feel the cold metal of his wedding band pressing against my skin. The urge to pick up the silver steak knife next to my plate and drive it through the back of his hand was so overpowering that I had to physically lock my muscles in place. They were all playing their parts flawlessly. The cruel mother, the perfect sister, the fake supportive husband. And they all expected me to play my assigned role as the tragic barren workaholic who just needed to try harder. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my heart rate to steady. I looked back up at my mother, then to Audrey, and finally to Richard. I let a soft, broken smile form on my lips, giving them exactly the reaction they wanted to see. I agreed with them. I softly admitted that they were right, and that I had been far too focused on my career. I promised I would start paying much closer attention to my family from now on. They all smiled satisfied that they had successfully put me back in my place. They had absolutely no idea that my promise was actually a death sentence for their entire world. The rest of the dinner proceeded with a sickening forced cheerfulness. My mother, entirely satisfied that she had successfully put me in my place, signaled for the housekeeper to clear the main courses. She brought out a decadent triple chocolate cake to celebrate Audrey and Andre expanding their family. Richard poured himself another heavy pour of scotch, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. He leaned back in his dining chair, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass, and began discussing commercial real estate trends with Andre. Audrey spent the entire dessert course prattling on about the imported Italian crib she wanted, and how she planned to hire a top-tier interior designer to transform their guest wing into a luxury nursery. I sat there eating my cake in small, deliberate bites. I watched them the same way I would review a doctored financial ledger. I catalogued every fake smile, every stolen glance between Richard and my sister, and every boastful claim Audrey made about the expensive surrogate she had supposedly hired. They were so incredibly drunk on their own perceived brilliance. They truly believed they had committed the perfect crime, leaving zero loose ends. But fraudsters always make one fatal mistake. They always underestimate the intelligence of the person they are scamming. As the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, I decided the performance had gone on long enough. I placed my silver dessert fork perfectly parallel to my spoon on the empty china plate. I reached for my crystal goblet of wine. I had barely touched it all evening, mindful of the pregnancy they had forced upon me, but I brought the rim to my lips and took a very small, calculated sip. The cool liquid coated my throat as I lowered the glass. I looked directly across the table at my sister. I let a warm, entirely pleasant smile spread across my face. I pitched my voice to sound perfectly light and conversational, completely stripping it of any malice or sarcasm. "Congratulations again on the wonderful news, Audrey," I said, making sure the entire table was listening. "Let us just hope the baby gets Richard's blue eyes instead of Andre's brown ones." The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The entire dining room went completely dead silent. The lively background music, drifting from the living room, suddenly sounded deafening. Clatter. The heavy silver fork slipped right out of Richard's hand and crashed loudly against his porcelain plate. His head snapped toward me so fast, I thought his neck might break. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the arrogant smirk utterly wiped from his features. Audrey completely froze mid-sentence. Her hand, which had been gesturing animatedly about nursery paint colors, hovered suspended in the air. Her perfectly manicured fingers twitched. Her eyes darted frantically toward Richard for a fraction of a second, before snapping back to me wide with sudden, unadulterated panic. My mother stopped pouring coffee. She looked at me with a deep, confused scowl, entirely missing the lethal subtext of my comment. She sharply demanded to know what on earth I was talking about, and why I would make such a ridiculous statement. Andre just let out a deep, booming laugh, completely unaware of the radioactive bomb I had just detonated in the middle of his family dinner. He shook his head, his kind brown eyes crinkling with amusement. He said that was a very weird joke to make, Emily, but he assured me that the baby would definitely have his strong family genes, regardless of the surrogate. I did not explain. I did not laugh along with Andre. I simply kept my eyes locked directly on Richard. I watched a bead of cold sweat form at his temple. He was paralyzed. I had just injected a massive dose of pure unadulterated paranoia straight into his veins. He now knew that I knew something, but he had absolutely no idea how much I knew, or how I had found out. I gracefully pushed my chair back and stood up from the table. I smoothed down the front of my dress and picked up my purse. I looked at my mother and politely apologized for cutting the evening short. I explained that I had a massive forensic audit starting early the next morning and needed to get home to prepare my files. Before anyone could say another word, I turned and walked out of the formal dining room. I did not look back. I walked down the grand hallway, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I let myself out the heavy front door and stepped into the freezing, bracing night air. As I walked to my car, I could practically feel the suffocating tension I had left behind in that house. The seed of terror had been planted. Richard and Audrey were going to spend the rest of the night suffocating in their own panic, wondering when the other shoe was going to drop. I got into my car, started the engine, and glanced at the certified medical file, still resting securely in the passenger seat. The game had officially changed. I was no longer the unsuspecting victim. I was the architect of their destruction. I arrived home 20 minutes before Richard. I walked into the kitchen, turned on the pendant lights above the marble island, and unlocked my leather work briefcase. I did not take out the certified medical file from Dr. Thorne. That was my ultimate weapon, and I was saving it. Instead, I pulled out a single sheet of paper I had printed at the office earlier that week. It was a decrypted statement from one of Richard's secondary credit accounts, an account he falsely believed was securely hidden behind a shell corporation. I placed the document in the center of the island, poured myself a glass of iced water, and waited. 15 minutes later, I heard the aggressive screech of tires pulling into the driveway. The heavy front door swung open and slammed shut with enough force to rattle the framed pictures. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Richard stormed into the kitchen, his face flushed dark red with fabricated rage. He had spent the drive home convincing himself that the best defense against my comment at dinner was a massive offense. He threw his keys onto the counter and pointed a shaking finger at me. He started screaming immediately. He demanded to know what was wrong with me and called my behavior absolutely disgusting. He paced back and forth across the hardwood floor, his voice echoing loudly. He told me that my petty jealousy over Audrey had finally crossed the line into complete delusion. He accused me of trying to humiliate him in front of my family and Andre just because I was bitter about my own failed fertility treatments. He had the audacity to call me mentally unstable, suggesting that the intense hormones I had been injecting for years had completely fried my brain. I stood on the opposite side of the marble island sipping my water. I let him yell. I let him exhaust his entire arsenal of gaslighting and manipulation. I watched his chest heave as he tried to catch his breath, waiting for me to break down in tears or start screaming back in defense. That was always his strategy. He wanted me emotional and hysterical so he could play the rational husband, but I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. When he finally stopped pacing and glared at me, the silence was absolute and suffocating. I set my glass down. I looked at his red, furious face and let out a soft sigh. I told him his performance was incredibly loud, but structurally very weak. Then I reached out and placed my index finger on the single sheet of paper resting on the marble island. I looked him dead in the eye and slowly slid the document across the smooth surface until it stopped right in front of him. I suggested he take a very close look at the highlighted line item before he continued diagnosing my mental health. Richard looked down at the paper. For a second, his face was still twisted in arrogant anger. But the moment his eyes registered the bank logo at the top of the statement, his posture stiffened. He cautiously picked up the paper. I walked him through the numbers using my crisp, professional courtroom voice. I pointed out the date of the transaction exactly 6 weeks ago. I pointed out the vendor name Genesis Elite Fertility Center, and then I pointed to the final billing amount. $200,000. I watched his eyes frantically scan the text, locking onto the specific alphanumeric billing code. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the cool marble. I told him that standard in vitro fertilization cycles do not cost $200,000. I explained that I ran that billing code through my forensic software and it perfectly matched a highly specialized VIP donor extraction and third-party implantation procedure. I kept my voice low and steady. I then pointed to the very last line of the highlighted section. The patient name listed under the billing memo. Audrey. The paper began to tremble violently in his hands. The color completely vanished from his face for the second time that night. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The aggressive, screaming bully from 2 minutes ago had entirely evaporated, replaced by a terrified man, realizing he left a massive financial footprint. I tilted my head, studying him like a complicated spreadsheet. I asked him if he wanted to explain why he paid $200,000 to secretly harvest my sister's eggs, or if he preferred to keep screaming about my disgusting jealousy. The confrontation had officially exploded, and he had absolutely nowhere left to hide. Richard collapsed against the marble counter, all the fight instantly draining out of him. The terrifying reality of his exposed financial trail finally broke through his arrogant facade. He ran a trembling hand through his hair and let out a breathless, desperate laugh. Then he looked up at me, and instead of dropping to his knees and begging for forgiveness, he did something far more sickening. He tried to justify it. He confessed to the affair with a chillingly calm, practical tone. He said it started over a year ago. Audrey had been complaining about Andre constantly pressuring her to start a family. Audrey did not want to ruin her perfect body, and she was terrified of the physical toll of pregnancy. Richard stepped closer to the island, his eyes pleading with me to understand his completely warped logic. He said that I was the one who desperately wanted to be pregnant. He reminded me of how I cried in the bathroom every time an embryo transfer failed. In his twisted sociopathic mind, he had engineered the perfect solution for everyone. He told me he was simply giving everyone exactly what they wanted. Audrey got to keep her flawless modeling figure. Andre got the biological child he was demanding. Richard got to sleep with my sister. And I finally got to experience the pregnancy I had been begging for. He actually smiled a small, pathetic smile and said I should be thanking him for fixing an impossible situation. I stood there completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his delusion. He genuinely believed that forging my signature, violating my body, and orchestrating medical rape was just a clever logistical compromise. Before I could even respond to his grotesque confession, the heavy wooden front door flew open. The sharp, frantic clicking of high heels echoed rapidly down the hallway. My mother, Diana, burst into the kitchen. She had obviously driven straight over from the dinner party. My comment at the table had sent Audrey into a total panic, and Diana had come to do immediate damage control. She was still wearing her expensive dinner dress, her face flushed red with exertion and anger. Diana stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the two of us standing across the kitchen island. Her eyes darted to the printed credit card statement resting on the marble. Richard immediately dropped his head into his hands. He looked at my mother and whimpered that I knew everything. He told her I had found the payment to the fertility clinic. For a fraction of a second, I actually thought my mother might defend me. She demanded to know what was wrong with me. She screamed that Andre was worth millions of dollars, and that he worshipped the ground Audrey walked on. She told me that if I exposed this secret, Andre would divorce Audrey instantly and leave her with absolutely nothing. She pointed a manicured finger at my stomach and coldly stated that the hard part was already done. I was already pregnant. She commanded me to stop being so incredibly selfish, to carry the baby to term and to hand it over to Audrey like a good sister. She said it was the least I could do to repay the family for always being such a difficult, ungrateful daughter. I looked from my mother's furious face to Richard's cowardly, relieved posture in the corner. They had completely aligned against me. They expected me to just swallow my trauma and be their obedient incubator to protect Audrey's luxury lifestyle. The stinging in my cheek slowly faded, replaced by an absolute freezing clarity. They did not view me as a human being. I was just an asset to be managed. And it was in that exact moment I realized I had absolutely no family left to lose. I let my shoulders collapse. I allowed the stinging pain in my cheek to force tears into my eyes. I sank to the kitchen floor, burying my face in my hands, and began to sob. It was a performance, but they bought it instantly because it was exactly what they expected. The weak, desperate daughter finally breaking under the weight of their demands. My mother stood over me, her breathing heavy but satisfied. She coldly told me to clean myself up, get some rest, and remember my place. Richard did not say a word. He just let out a pathetic sigh of relief. He actually had the nerve to awkwardly pat my shoulder, telling me that things would settle down, and we would figure out a new normal. My mother marched out of the kitchen. A few moments later, the heavy front door closed. Her car engine roared to life and faded into the distance. Richard poured himself a glass of water, avoiding my eyes entirely, and muttered that he was sleeping in the guest bedroom tonight to give me space. He walked down the hall and the guest room door shut. I remained on the cold tile floor for another minute, listening to the heavy silence of the house. The moment I was absolutely sure I was alone, I stopped crying. The tears vanished as if a faucet had been violently shut off. I wiped my face and stood up. My cheek still throbbed fiercely, but I welcomed the pain. It kept my mind razor sharp and devoid of any sentimentality. I walked over to the island, picked up the decrypted credit card statement, and folded it neatly. I was no longer a grieving wife. I was a senior forensic accountant, and my husband had just made the catastrophic mistake of leaving a financial trail in my own house. I walked into my home office and locked the heavy oak door behind me. I pulled my encrypted work laptop from my briefcase and set it on the mahogany desk. I plugged it directly into the secure Ethernet port, bypassing our home network. I sat down and cracked my knuckles. Richard thought he was a financial genius because he knew how to hide a credit card behind a generic corporate address. But he was an amateur playing against a professional who dismantled corporate fraud rings for a living. I booted up my specialized tracking software, a proprietary program used to trace dark money. I started with the $200,000 payment to the fertility center. Richard had routed that money through a shell company registered in Delaware. It took me less than 12 minutes to pierce the corporate veil and find his digital signature. A payment that large required massive funding, and I needed to know exactly where the capital originated. Richard made a comfortable salary, but he did not have $250,000 in liquid cash sitting unnoticed. I ran a comprehensive sweep of his social security number, cross-referencing it with regional banking nodes. The software chewed through the data, lighting up my screen with routing numbers and wire transfers. Richard had been incredibly busy while I was working. I discovered 4 hidden bank accounts and 2 investment portfolios. He was systematically funneling money out of our joint savings. But as I traced the wire transfers backwards, I noticed a strange repetitive pattern. The largest deposits into his hidden accounts were not coming from his consulting firm. They were being wired directly from a commercial development account. I squinted at the screen, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I ran the routing number through the federal database. The screen refreshed, displaying the name of the registered business entity. It was the primary operating account for my brother-in-law's architectural firm. Richard was not just cheating, he was actively embezzling massive amounts of money from Andre. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating the dark room. The sheer scale of his arrogance was breathtaking. He was sleeping with Audrey, using Andre's money to pay for the illicit embryo extraction, and letting Andre foot the entire bill for their twisted fantasy. I began downloading every single ledger and fraudulent invoice Richard had created, compiling them into an encrypted master file. I was building a cage out of his own financial data, and I was going to make sure the bars were completely unbreakable. Dawn broke over the house, casting long, cold shadows across the kitchen floor. I had not slept a single minute. I spent the entire night exporting the encrypted ledgers of Richard's massive embezzlement scheme to a secure external hard drive, completely tightening the financial noose around his neck. At 6 in the morning, I heard the guest bedroom door open. Heavy footsteps moved confidently down the hallway. Richard walked into the kitchen already dressed in his sharpest charcoal-tailored suit. The pathetic, terrified man from last night had completely vanished. Bolstered by my mother's vicious intervention and his own sociopathic arrogance, he looked incredibly smug. He walked over to the coffee maker, poured himself a dark mug, and then dropped a thick stack of legal documents onto the marble island right next to my laptop. He tapped the thick stack of paper with his index finger. He told me that since we were all operating under a new understanding, we needed to formalize the arrangement to avoid any future confusion. I looked down at the document. It was a hastily drafted, incredibly dense post-nuptial agreement. Richard took a slow sip of his coffee and casually explained the terms. He stated that the document legally reclassified my status in our marriage. Retrospectively, it designated me as an independent gestational carrier for Audrey. He said it was just a necessary precaution to protect everyone's financial and emotional investments. He spoke about my body and the child growing inside me, as if we were nothing more than real estate assets, undergoing a standard transfer of corporate ownership. His voice was perfectly steady, utterly devoid of any moral conflict or human empathy. I picked up the document and began reading the specific clauses. Richard had actually hired a shady attorney to draft an extreme penalty clause. He leaned against the counter, casually crossing his arms, and delivered his ultimate threat. He told me that if I decided to terminate the pregnancy or if I dared to file for divorce before the baby was safely delivered and legally adopted by Andre and Audrey, I would be in immediate breach of contract. The financial penalty for that breach was a staggering $5 million. He smiled a cold, triumphant smile. He told me that if I tried to blow this situation up, he would drag me through civil court for years, completely destroy my professional reputation as an accountant, and bankrupt me long before I ever saw a dime of my own money. He thought his legal threat made him completely untouchable. He assumed that throwing a massive dollar amount at a financial auditor would instantly paralyze me with fear. But as I read the dense legal jargon, it took every ounce of my professional discipline not to burst into laughter directly in his face. Richard was a corporate consultant, not a lawyer, and certainly not a forensic investigator. He was entirely oblivious to the fundamental legal principle that a contract designed to enforce a criminal act is instantly void under federal law. By forcing me to sign a document that explicitly outlined a financially motivated non-consensual medical procedure, he was not protecting his assets. He was literally handing me a signed date-stamped confession of his own extortion, coercion, and conspiracy to commit medical battery. But I did not point out the catastrophic legal flaws in his master plan. I knew that fraudsters are most vulnerable when they feel the most secure. Instead, I let my hands tremble violently as I held the crisp white pages. I looked up at him, widening my eyes to mimic total defeat and pure panic. I asked him how he could possibly be so cruel to me after everything we had built together. I let my voice crack dramatically, begging him to reconsider, telling him I could never afford a $5 million legal penalty, and that he was going to ruin my life. My performance fed his massive, fragile ego perfectly. He stepped closer, his chest puffed out with arrogant authority, and handed me a heavy silver pen. He coldly told me I would not have to pay a single cent as long as I just stayed quiet, did my job, and successfully delivered the baby for Audrey. I took the heavy silver pen from his hand, feeling the cool metal against my skin. I hesitated for a few long seconds, letting him savor what he thought was his ultimate victory before pressing the dark blue ink to the paper. I signed my name perfectly at the bottom of every single page. Richard watched my every move with a look of supreme, toxic satisfaction. He snatched the thick document off the marble island the second I finished the final signature. He tucked it proudly into his expensive leather briefcase, snapped the brass lock shut, and told me he would see me at dinner. He walked out the front door, truly believing he had trapped me in an inescapable legal cage. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed for his federal indictment. The sound of Richard's car engine faded down the street. I stood by the kitchen window, watching his silver sedan disappear around the corner. He actually believed that a signed piece of paper could protect him from the consequences of his actions. But as a forensic accountant who regularly works alongside federal prosecutors, I knew the absolute truth about what had just happened. A contract drafted to enforce a felony is not a binding legal document. It is a signed date-stamped confession. By legally threatening me with a $5 million penalty for terminating a pregnancy he initiated through medical forgery, he had officially crossed the line from domestic abuse into federal extortion. But Richard did not know that. He thought he had completely won. I needed him to stay in that arrogant, comfortable delusion for as long as possible. For the next 5 days, I delivered the greatest performance of my entire life. I completely embraced the role of the terrified, defeated victim. When Richard came home from work, I made sure he found me sitting quietly on the couch, wearing baggy sweatpants, and staring blankly at the television. I stopped wearing makeup. I spoke in a soft, submissive whisper. I agreed with every single thing he said. I wanted him to look at me and see a woman whose spirit had been entirely crushed under the weight of his brilliance. My performance worked flawlessly. Richard's arrogance swelled to incredibly dangerous levels. Fraudsters thrive on a false sense of absolute control, and I was giving him all the control he could ever want. He stopped closing his home office door when he took phone calls. He stopped clearing his browser history. He even started speaking to Audrey on the phone while I was in the next room, completely unbothered by my presence, because he truly believed I was too paralyzed by his legal threats to ever do anything about it. My mother and Audrey also reveled in my newly broken state. Audrey called me every morning to remind me to take my prenatal vitamins, speaking to me with the slow, exaggerated tone one might use for a disobedient child. My mother texted me daily, demanding updates on my diet and instructing me not to stress the baby. I answered every call and replied to every text with meek, compliant agreement. I swallowed my pride and let them treat me like a rented incubator. Every time I submitted to their cruelty, Richard's guard dropped another massive fraction of an inch. By the time Saturday morning arrived, Richard was so incredibly relaxed that he did not even bother to lock his home office. He came into the kitchen dressed in his crisp golf polo and expensive slacks. He cheerfully announced that he was heading to the country club to play 18 holes with Andre. The absolute sociopathy required to go play golf with the man whose company you are actively bankrupting was staggering, but I just offered him a weak smile and told him to have a good time. He kissed the top of my head like I was a loyal pet, and walked out the door. The absolute second his car cleared the driveway, my defeated posture vanished. I stood up straight, rolled my shoulders back, and walked directly into his pristine home office. My initial network sweep had successfully identified the offshore destination of his embezzled funds, but the accounts were locked behind heavy randomized encryption keys. My software could track the money, but I could not pull the hard, unredacted bank statements without his master passwords. I needed physical access to his machine. I walked over to his custom desktop tower, resting beneath the mahogany desk. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a microscopic hardware-based keystroke logger. It was a tiny device cleverly disguised to look exactly like the standard USB receiver for a wireless mouse. I knelt down and plugged the logger directly into the back motherboard panel, nesting it perfectly between his monitor cables, where he would never think to look. Then I booted up his computer using a bypass script from my encrypted flash drive. It took exactly 3 minutes to synchronize the hardware logger to broadcast a secure encrypted signal directly to my work laptop. I carefully wiped down the desk, making sure I did not leave a single trace of my presence, and shut the door behind me. 4 hours later, Richard returned from the golf course laughing and boasting about his score on the back nine. He took a shower and then casually walked into his home office to check some emails. I sat quietly in the spare bedroom down the hall, staring at my encrypted screen. Lines of green text began to populate my monitor in real time. The hidden logger was capturing every single keystroke Richard made. I watched him type his master password into his secure vault. I watched him log into the architectural firm's back-end server. I watched him enter the routing numbers for the offshore trust fund he had set up for Audrey. He was literally handing me the keys to his entire fraudulent kingdom, one keystroke at a time, completely unaware that the broken, terrified wife sitting in the next room was systematically preparing his federal indictment. The green text finally stopped scrolling across my monitor when Richard logged out of his computer and went to bed. I sat in the dark spare room for another hour, listening to the absolute silence of the house until I was certain he was fast asleep. Then I opened a new encrypted window on my laptop and typed in the master password the hidden logger had just captured. My heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm as the security firewalls of my husband's digital life collapsed one by one. I was no longer on the outside looking in. I had the keys to the entire kingdom. I bypassed the standard checking and savings accounts entirely. I went straight for the hidden offshore portals he had accessed earlier that afternoon. Using his credentials, I logged directly into the administrative back-end of Andre's architectural firm. Because Richard was their senior financial consultant, he had top-tier clearance to approve vendor payments and manage contractor budgets. It was the perfect position for a thief. I began running a comparative analysis between the firm's approved budgets and the actual wire transfers sent over the last 14 months. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking. Richard was not just skimming off the top, he was financially butchering my brother-in-law. I found dozens of dummy invoices for phantom construction materials and fake environmental consulting fees. Richard would approve a massive payment to a shell company he had secretly registered in Delaware, and from there the money was instantly wired out of the country. I traced the digital footprint across 3 different international banking nodes until I finally hit the destination account. It was a private wealth management bank located in the Cayman Islands. I opened the account dossier, and the final horrifying puzzle piece clicked firmly into place. The offshore account was not a standard holding fund. It was a highly specialized irrevocable trust fund. I downloaded the legal charter and scanned the digitized paperwork. The designated beneficiary of this multi-million-dollar trust was listed as the unborn child currently growing inside my womb. But a child cannot manage offshore assets. They need a trustee. I scrolled down to the signature page to see who controlled the money. The sole trustee holding absolute and unrestricted access to the entire principal amount was Audrey. I sat back in my chair, the cold glow of the screen illuminating the dark room. The numbers staring back at me told a story far more sinister than a simple workplace affair. The total amount already funneled into the trust was staggering. Richard had stolen nearly $2 million of Andre's hard-earned money. And based on the pending invoices sitting in his draft folder, he was preparing to drain another massive lump sum right before the end of the fiscal quarter. The absolute brilliance and pure evil of their plan washed over me. This was never just about Audrey wanting to keep her perfect modeling figure. That was just a convenient excuse. This was a calculated, synchronized heist. Richard and Audrey were systematically bleeding Andre dry. They were going to bankrupt his architectural firm from the inside out. Once the money was securely hidden in the Cayman Islands, and once I had physically delivered the baby, they were going to detonate our lives. Audrey would divorce the financially ruined Andre, and Richard would leave me. They would take the baby, claim the offshore fortune under the guise of the child's trust fund, and disappear to live a life of luxury entirely funded by the 2 people they had destroyed. They viewed Andre and me as nothing more than beasts of burden. Andre was the workhorse, generating the wealth, and I was the incubator, growing their child. We were just disposable assets in their grand, sociopathic business plan. A heavy, suffocating wave of disgust rolled through my stomach, but I forced it down. Emotion was the enemy of execution. I highlighted every single fraudulent invoice, every fake shell company registration, and every wire transfer receipt. I downloaded the entire trust fund charter bearing Audrey's name. I packaged all of it into a massive, heavily encrypted federal evidence file and mirrored it to 3 separate secure cloud servers. I made absolutely sure that even if Richard threw my laptop into a river, the evidence would survive. I closed my laptop and looked toward the hallway leading to the master bedroom where my husband was sleeping. He thought he had outsmarted a senior forensic accountant. He thought his forged medical consent forms and illegal postnuptial agreement made him a mastermind. But he had just made the ultimate mistake. He had given me a paper trail that crossed international borders. He had elevated his disgusting betrayal from a messy family divorce into a massive federal crime. I did not just have enough evidence to leave him. I had enough evidence to put both him and my golden child sister in a federal penitentiary for a very long time. The next morning, the doorbell rang sharply at exactly 10 o'clock. I was sitting at the kitchen island drinking a cup of decaf coffee, mentally reviewing the massive federal evidence file I had secured the night before. I walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. Audrey was standing on my porch, dressed in a flawless cream-colored cashmere sweater set and designer sunglasses despite the overcast sky. She was holding a small, expensive-looking paper gift bag from an upscale organic pharmacy. I took a deep breath, instantly dropping back into my role of the broken, defeated sister, and opened the door. Audrey pushed past me without waiting for an invitation. She walked straight into my kitchen, her heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floor. She placed the small paper bag on the marble island with a dramatic sigh and took off her sunglasses. She looked around my house with an expression of mild distaste, as if merely being in my presence was a tedious charity project she had been forced to undertake. She turned to me and offered a tight, condescending smile. She told me she had brought me some imported prenatal vitamins. She said they were specifically formulated to prevent stretch marks and minimize the physical damage the pregnancy was going to cause to my body. She emphasized the word damage, dragging out the syllables to make sure the insult landed perfectly. She leaned against the counter, casually crossing her arms, and began to inspect me from head to toe. She clicked her tongue and shook her head slowly. She remarked that I was already looking a bit puffy around the face even though I was barely in my second trimester. She said it was such a shame how much pregnancy completely ruined a woman's figure, adding that she was incredibly grateful she never had to subject herself to that kind of permanent physical deterioration. She spoke about me as if I were a piece of rented farm equipment, a temporary vessel whose only value was the cargo it was carrying. She then had the absolute audacity to reach out and pat my stomach. Her manicured hand felt like ice through my thin shirt. She told me I needed to make sure I was eating strictly organic foods because she did not want her baby absorbing any cheap processed chemicals. She actually used the phrase "her baby looking me dead in the eye," fully establishing her dominance over my own body. She said that once the baby was born, I could go back to working my crazy accountant hours and she would take over the real work of raising an elite high society child. I stood completely still, forcing my shoulders to slump. I kept my eyes focused on the floor, offering a weak nod. I thanked her for the vitamins in a quiet, submissive voice. I told her I was doing my best to make sure everything was perfect for her and Richard. My utter lack of resistance seemed to bore her. She had come expecting a fight, or at least some pathetic begging, but my total compliance just proved to her that I had entirely given up. She rolled her eyes, picked up her sunglasses, and checked her reflection in the microwave door. She announced that she had to leave because she had a private Pilates session and then a lunch meeting with her interior designer to finalize the nursery wallpaper. She grabbed her massive customized designer handbag from the counter and slung it over her shoulder. She told me to get some rest because I looked incredibly tired, and then turned to walk down the hallway toward the front door. I followed a few steps behind her, playing the dutiful host. As we reached the entryway, Audrey stopped to adjust her cashmere sweater in the large mirror hanging by the door. She set her heavy designer handbag down on the small console table for just a few seconds. That was all the time I needed. I had been holding a tiny voice-activated micro-audio recorder in the palm of my hand ever since I opened the door. It was no bigger than a standard flash drive wrapped in black tape to eliminate any reflective surfaces. While Audrey was busy admiring her own reflection, I seamlessly reached out and dropped the tiny device straight into the deep dark side pocket of her bag. It slid silently to the bottom, completely hidden among her makeup compacts and loose receipts. Audrey picked her bag back up, entirely oblivious. She opened the front door, let the freezing outside air rush in, and gave me one last incredibly arrogant smirk. She told me she would check on my progress next week and walked out to her car. I stood in the doorway watching her drive away. She thought she had just spent 20 minutes successfully humiliating her older sister. She had absolutely no idea she was now carrying a highly sensitive federal wiretap directly back into the heart of her criminal conspiracy. As Audrey's car disappeared from view, I went straight back into my home office and locked the door. I booted up my secure laptop and opened the specialized audio monitoring software. The tiny device I had slipped into her bag was voice-activated and transmitted its recordings via an encrypted cellular band. For the first few hours, it was just the mundane, incredibly irritating sounds of her privileged life. I heard the instructor at her private Pilates class counting reps, the clinking of heavy silverware during her lunch with the interior designer, and her loudly complaining to a store clerk about the exact shade of ivory she wanted for the nursery walls. It was tedious work, but patience is the absolute core of forensic accounting. I kept my headphones firmly on my ears and waited for the one conversation that actually mattered. The real payoff came the following afternoon. Richard had kissed me goodbye that morning, telling me he was going to be working late at the corporate office to finalize a massive quarterly audit for a client. But when the audio feed crackled to life at 5 o'clock, the background noise was not a bustling corporate boardroom. It was the distinct smooth jazz and low murmur of a high-end hotel bar. Then I heard Richard's voice. He confidently ordered 2 incredibly expensive martinis and greeted Audrey with a sickeningly familiar kiss. I immediately hit the master record button on my software, making absolutely sure every single syllable they spoke was captured and backed up to my secure cloud servers in real time. They started their private celebration by mocking my total compliance. Audrey laughed her high-pitched, grating laugh eagerly, telling Richard all about her visit to my house the previous day. She described me as completely broken and pathetic, joking that I was like an obedient dog finally learning my place in the family hierarchy. Richard chuckled, his voice dripping with supreme toxic arrogance. He told her my absolute submission was exactly what he had calculated from the very beginning. He bragged about the illegal post-nuptial agreement he had forced me to sign, boasting that tying a $5 million penalty to the pregnancy had completely paralyzed my analytical brain. He actually called me a naive number cruncher who was so terrified of losing her career that she simply rolled over and accepted her fate. I sat alone in my dark office, letting their cruel laughter wash over me, without a single flinch or shed tear. Then the conversation shifted from domestic cruelty to their massive federal conspiracy. Audrey lowered her voice, sounding suddenly impatient, and asked about the money. She complained that pretending to be a glowing mother-to-be was exhausting, and she demanded to know the exact timeline for their escape. Richard quickly assured her that everything was perfectly on schedule. He explicitly detailed his plan to execute one final massive wire transfer from Andre's commercial development account right before the end of the fiscal quarter. He confidently stated that this final extraction would completely shatter the architectural firm's liquidity and leave it utterly bankrupt. The sheer breathtaking sociopathy of their endgame was laid bare in crystal-clear audio. Richard explained the exit strategy step by step. He said that once the firm collapsed, Andre would be buried under a mountain of corporate debt and catastrophic personal liability. In the ensuing chaos, Audrey would file for an expedited divorce, falsely claiming Andre had hidden the financial ruin from her. Simultaneously, once I delivered the baby, Richard would trigger the fabricated breach of contract clause, divorce me, and take full legal custody of the child. They would then take their newly born trust fund millionaire and disappear to the Cayman Islands. They were going to leave Andre and me holding the burning ashes of our destroyed lives while they drank champagne on a private beach. The most sickening part of the recording was how they spoke about Andre. Audrey called her hard-working, deeply devoted husband a gullible workhorse. She laughed about how Andre was practically killing himself taking on extra commercial contracts just to fund the offshore trust that was actively draining his own company. She said Andre was so blinded by his pure desire to be a father that he practically handed her the keys to his entire corporate vault. Richard eagerly agreed, calling his own golfing buddy a useful idiot whose architectural genius was only good for padding their illicit early retirement fund. I heard the sharp chime of crystal as they actually clinked their martini glasses together in a toast to his stupidity. I took off my headphones and took a long, deep breath. The audio files were pristine, free of any obscuring background interference. The voices were undeniably theirs, and their criminal intent was explicitly outlined. I now possessed an ironclad digital confession that perfectly corroborated every single fraudulent invoice and offshore wire transfer I had traced the night before. I had the motive, the method, and the exact timeline. But this was no longer a battle I could fight alone. Andre's entire life and legacy were resting on a financial landmine that was about to detonate. He deserved the chance to defend himself. I picked up my phone and opened a secure, untraceable messaging app. It was finally time to pull my brother-in-law out of the dark. I sent Andre a single text message through the encrypted application. I did not mention Richard or Audrey. I simply told him that his architectural firm was actively hemorrhaging capital, his personal assets were in immediate jeopardy, and he needed to meet me if he wanted to save his life's work. I gave him the address of a rundown 24-hour diner located an hour north of the city. I told him to tell Audrey he was visiting a distant commercial job site and to make absolutely sure he was not followed. I arrived 30 minutes early. I sat in a faded vinyl booth in the back corner of the empty diner, sipping a mug of terrible black coffee. I arranged the 3 heavy manila folders on the chipped formica table in front of me, perfectly aligning their edges. This was the most critical presentation of my entire career. Andre walked through the glass doors right on time. He looked incredibly exhausted. He wore a heavy wool winter coat over his tailored suit, and his jaw was set in a tight, frustrated line. He spotted me in the corner, walked over, and slid into the booth across from me. He immediately crossed his arms over his chest. He kept his voice low, but the anger and impatience radiating from him were palpable. He told me he did not have time for games. He said he loved my sister, and he respected my marriage to Richard, but he absolutely refused to be dragged into whatever petty domestic drama was currently tearing our family apart. He stated firmly that he was working 90-hour weeks to prepare for his new baby and could not afford to play the role of family mediator. I did not apologize for wasting his time. I did not offer any emotional preamble or soft apologies. I looked at him with the cold, detached professionalism I used when dismantling corporate criminals in a boardroom. I told him he was right about one thing. He was working 90-hour weeks. But he was not working to prepare for his new baby. He was working to fund his own financial execution. I placed my hand firmly on the first manila folder and slid it across the table until it touched his fingers. I told him this was not about domestic drama. It was about federal fraud. I instructed him to open it. He hesitated for a second, his dark eyes narrowing with deep suspicion before flipping the heavy cover open. He stared down at the certified medical documents from Genesis Elite Fertility Center. I watched his eyes scan the forged signatures and the specialized genetic barcode analysis. I kept my voice perfectly steady. I stated that the baby Audrey claimed was coming from an anonymous surrogate was actually her own biological child, conceived with my husband, and illegally implanted into my body without my knowledge or consent. All the color instantly drained from Andre's face. He looked up at me, his mouth opening slightly to protest, to call me insane to defend the wife he loved. But before he could form a single word of denial, I pushed the second folder across the table. I told him the second folder contained 70 pages of transcribed audio recordings captured just yesterday afternoon at a downtown hotel bar. I explained that the transcripts detailed exactly how his wife and my husband had orchestrated their affair. It documented how they laughed at his absolute blind trust and exactly how they planned to leave the country together once the child was born. I watched his large hands begin to shake as he read the highlighted paragraphs. He read the exact quotes of Audrey mocking his work ethic and Richard calling him a useful idiot. He looked like a man who had just been thrown from a moving vehicle. His breathing grew shallow and rapid as the crushing weight of the betrayal slammed into him. But I could not give him a moment to process the emotional devastation because the financial devastation was the immediate ticking threat. I pushed the third and thickest folder directly into his line of sight. I told him the first two folders were designed to break his heart, but the third folder was designed to put him in federal prison if he did not act immediately. I broke down the forensic audit piece by piece. I explained that Richard had been using his executive clearance to systematically embezzle nearly $2 million from the architectural firm over the last 14 months. I showed him the fake invoices, the shell companies, and the offshore wire transfers. I pointed directly to the Cayman Islands Trust Fund charter. I told him that Audrey was the sole trustee of his stolen fortune. I laid out their exact exit strategy. They were going to bankrupt his firm by the end of the fiscal quarter, leave him drowning in catastrophic corporate debt, divorce us, and disappear to the islands to raise their child using his money. Andre closed the third folder. He did not yell. He did not pound his fists on the table or break down in tears. He just sat there in the dim light of the diner, staring at the chipped formica. The decent, trusting man who had walked into the diner 10 minutes ago was completely gone. I watched Andre stare at the chipped formica table. For a long minute, the only sound in our corner of the empty diner was the low hum of the neon sign. I expected him to bury his face in his hands to scream or rush out the doors to confront his wife. But he did none of those things. As the muscles in his jaw tightened, I saw a remarkable transformation take place. The warm brother-in-law who always tried to keep the peace was entirely erased. In his place sat the ruthless architect who built a commercial real estate empire from scratch. Andre slowly closed the federal evidence file. He rested his large hands flat on the manila cover, grounding himself. When he finally looked up at me, his dark brown eyes were stripped of any warmth. They were as hard and cold as polished obsidian. He did not shed a single tear for the marriage he had just lost. Instead, his analytical mind was already calculating the structural integrity of the crisis, analyzing the financial damage, and drawing up blueprints for a total demolition. He asked me in a perfectly steady voice if Richard had any idea that I possessed this information. I shook my head. I told him my husband truly believed I was completely broken and entirely paralyzed by the fake post-nuptial agreement he had forced me to sign. Andre nodded slowly. A terrifyingly calm understanding passed between us. We were two hard-working people who had been violently pushed out of our own families, reduced to disposable stepping stones to serve the monumental arrogance of our spouses. In that silent diner booth over cold cups of terrible coffee, we forged an unspoken, lethal alliance. We were no longer their unsuspecting victims. We were the architects of their absolute destruction. Andre pushed his empty ceramic mug to the side. He leaned forward and told me that if we went to the federal authorities right now, the situation would immediately become messy. He explained that Richard might have hidden contingency accounts we had not discovered. Furthermore, Audrey would hire high-powered defense attorneys to spin a narrative of emotional coercion. She would cry in front of a sympathetic judge, claim she was manipulated by my husband, and try to walk away with half of Andre's personal assets in a brutal divorce settlement. We could not allow them to control the narrative or access a single cent of their stolen funds for their legal defense. I agreed completely. I told him we needed to catch them in the absolute middle of their final, most arrogant act. We needed an undeniable, heavily documented federal crime executed right in front of witnesses. Andre leaned back against the vinyl booth, his sharp mind racing ahead. He told me that Richard had been aggressively pressing him all week to authorize a massive liquidity transfer for a supposedly crucial commercial concrete contract. Richard wanted exactly $1.5 million moved into a holding account by the end of the current fiscal week. Andre realized this transfer was the final extraction Richard and Audrey had been laughing about on the audio recording. This was the exact financial move designed to bankrupt his firm and fund their island escape. A cold, predatory smile touched the corners of Andre's mouth. He looked dead into my eyes and casually stated that he was going to approve the transfer tomorrow morning. I stared at him instantly, understanding the sheer brilliance of his strategy. By willingly approving the transfer, Andre was going to let Richard walk straight into an inescapable federal wire fraud trap. But Andre was not going to use his standard commercial banking channels. He told me he was going to route the $1.5 million through a highly specialized, federally monitored escrow account that he used exclusively for government municipal contracts. The absolute second Richard attempted to illegally divert those flagged funds into his offshore trust, he would trigger an automatic, irreversible red alert directly with the FBI. It was a flawless financial trap. But I had one final condition. I told Andre that federal prison and financial ruin were not enough. They had violated my body, stolen my agency, and humiliated us both in front of our family. They needed to be destroyed socially, professionally, and publicly. I reminded him that Audrey was hosting her lavish baby shower at my house next weekend. Andre looked at me, completely understanding the assignment. He reached across the chipped table and shook my hand, firmly sealing our pact. We agreed to play our roles flawlessly for one more week. We would let them climb to the absolute peak of their arrogant delusions, and then at the baby shower, we would push them off the cliff. Andre drove home from the diner that night and walked into his massive suburban house fully prepared to deliver the performance of his life. He found Audrey lounging on the living room sofa, flipping through a luxury catalog of imported Italian baby furniture. She offered him a flawless, perfectly manufactured smile and patted the cushion next to her. Andre sat down, wrapping his arm around the woman he knew was systematically destroying his life. He played the devoted husband with chilling perfection. Audrey leaned into his shoulder and casually brought up their financial future. She complained that the wealth management advisors were moving too slowly on setting up the private nursery trust. She told Andre she wanted to secure the child's financial future, immediately suggesting an initial deposit of $1.5 million. She phrased it as a loving mother wanting the absolute best for their expanding family. Andre smiled down at her, burying his intense disgust behind a mask of unconditional love. He kissed her forehead and promised to authorize the capital transfer the very next morning. Audrey's eyes lit up with triumphant greed. She had no idea she had just handed Andre the exact verbal confirmation he needed to lock the trap. The following morning, Andre arrived at his architectural firm and immediately called Richard into his glass-walled executive office. Andre played the role of the stressed but trusting boss. He told Richard he wanted to free up $1.5 million in liquid capital to fund Audrey's nursery trust, but needed to disguise it as a commercial expense to avoid an immediate tax hit. He asked Richard to handle the logistics. Richard's eyes gleamed with barely concealed excitement. He eagerly agreed, suggesting they temporarily park the funds in a holding account under the guise of an upcoming commercial concrete contract. It was exactly the move we had anticipated. While Richard scurried back to his desk to prepare the fraudulent paperwork, Andre sent me a single encrypted text message from his personal phone. It simply said, "The bait is in the water." I was sitting in my home office monitoring the keystroke logger I had installed on Richard's desktop. The moment Richard initiated the internal transfer request, I intercepted the routing protocol. This was where my expertise as a forensic accountant turned a simple embezzlement case into a massive federal felony. I instructed Andre to manually override the standard corporate holding account and instead route the $1.5 million through a highly specialized municipal escrow account located in New York. By forcing the money to cross state lines from Illinois to New York, the transaction instantly triggered the Interstate Commerce Clause. But more importantly, the specific New York escrow account Andre used was flagged for federal government oversight because it was historically tied to municipal infrastructure grants. Moving money into that account was perfectly legal. But the second an unauthorized party attempted to divert funds out of that specific federal account and route them to an offshore bank in the Cayman Islands, it automatically triggered a silent red alert within the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I watched my screen intently as Richard logged into the firm's financial portal. He saw the $1.5 million sitting perfectly in the New York escrow account. He did not hesitate for a single second. He was too blinded by his own arrogance and greed to recognize the structural anomalies of the account. He immediately generated a fake invoice for environmental consulting fees, attached it to a Delaware shell company, and initiated the outbound wire transfer to the Cayman Islands Trust Fund. I held my breath as the progress bar moved across my screen. The digital authorization pinged the New York server, the system verified his executive credentials, and then the transaction cleared. Richard pumped his fist in his office, believing he had just successfully stolen the final piece of his early retirement fund. But on my encrypted monitor, a completely different story unfolded. A secondary background process initiated instantly. A silent, automated federal flag was generated and sent directly to the United States Department of the Treasury. Richard had just committed multiple counts of federal wire fraud, interstate theft, and money laundering. The financial trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force. There was no going back, no settling out of court, and absolutely no way for Audrey or Richard to talk their way out of a federal indictment. The authorities now had a digitally stamped, undeniable record of their crime. All that was left to do was let them celebrate their fake victory at the baby shower, right before we burned their entire world to the ground. I did not sleep. Next morning, I took a scheduled personal day from my accounting firm and drove directly to a sleek, unmarked glass high-rise in downtown Chicago. I was not meeting with a standard divorce attorney. I had arranged a joint consultation with a top-tier medical malpractice litigator and a former federal prosecutor specializing in high-stakes corporate fraud. I walked into the expansive mahogany conference room and placed my encrypted laptop and the 3 manila folders onto the polished table. I did not waste time with emotional introductions. I simply opened the files and presented them with the fully documented anatomy of a multi-million-dollar federal conspiracy and a grotesque medical violation. The medical malpractice attorney, a sharp woman with decades of experience destroying corrupt hospitals, was the first to speak. She reviewed the forged surrogacy agreement and the genetic barcodes from Genesis Elite. Her professional composure slipped into genuine horror. She immediately began drafting the civil filings for medical battery, severe emotional distress, identity theft, and gross negligence against both Richard and the clinic administrators. She assured me the clinic's licenses would be suspended and their assets frozen pending federal review. But civil lawsuits were just the beginning. I wanted them stripped of their freedom, not just their bank accounts. I turned my attention to the former prosecutor and opened the financial ledgers. I walked him through the digital footprint of the $1.5 million wire transfer. I explained how Andre and I had specifically routed the funds through the federally flagged New York municipal escrow account before Richard diverted them to the Cayman Islands. The prosecutor actually smiled, a cold, predatory look that mirrored my own. He confirmed Richard had blindly triggered an automatic Treasury investigation. By crossing state lines and using a monitored government network, Richard and Audrey had elevated their embezzlement to massive federal wire fraud conspiracy to commit fraud and international money laundering. The prosecutor immediately contacted his active liaisons within the FBI Financial Crimes Division to secure the digital chain of custody and initiate the grand jury subpoenas. Simultaneously, Andre was taking his own lethal legal steps. While I was briefing the federal prosecutors, he was meeting with a cutthroat corporate litigation team. He legally severed Richard's executive access to all architectural firm accounts, placing a silent administrative lock that would not trigger until the exact moment of the arrests. He also drew up emergency divorce papers, citing absolute financial infidelity and criminal conspiracy. Andre ensured that Audrey would be locked out of their shared domestic accounts, their joint credit cards, and the security systems of their own home. By the time the weekend arrived, Audrey and Richard would technically be completely destitute, though they would not realize it until the handcuffs clicked around their wrists. The federal agents wanted to move immediately, but I refused. I explained that an immediate quiet arrest would allow Audrey to hide behind closed doors and play the victim for our family. She would spin a narrative of being an innocent wife duped by my husband. I wanted a public, undeniable execution of their social and professional lives. I told the authorities about the lavish baby shower Audrey was hosting that upcoming Saturday at the sprawling country club. I proposed coordinating the execution of the federal arrest warrants directly alongside the serving of the civil lawsuits in front of every single person they were trying to impress. The prosecutor agreed, recognizing that the absolute shock of a public takedown would prevent Richard from having any time to attempt a secondary offshore transfer or destroy physical evidence. With the legal snare perfectly set, I spent the rest of the week observing the final stages of their delusion. Audrey's baby shower preparations reached a level of manic, sickening extravagance. She sent out daily demands to my mother, finalizing the catering menu and enforcing a strict pastel color code for the guests. She even had the audacity to text me a list of incredibly expensive gifts she expected me to purchase for her child, reminding me that since I was saving so much money by not having my own nursery, I could afford to splurge on hers. I bought every single item on her registry without a single complaint. Richard was equally insufferable, strutting around our house with the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he was just days away from a tropical retirement. He packed his golf clubs into his trunk, whistling a cheerful tune, telling me how excited he was to celebrate our expanding family. They were entirely drunk on their own perceived brilliance, blissfully unaware that the FBI was currently monitoring their bank accounts and drawing up their federal indictments. As Friday night fell, I carefully laid out the drab, oversized maternity dress my mother had forced me to buy for the shower. The stage was finally set for their destruction. Saturday morning arrived with bright, mocking sunshine. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and pulled the drab, oversized beige maternity dress over my head. My mother had practically forced me to buy it, insisting that I needed to look modest and unassuming so as not to draw any attention away from Audrey on her special day. I looked completely washed out, entirely devoid of any glamour or status. It was exactly the image of a defeated, broken woman that my family wanted to see. I smoothed the cheap fabric over my stomach, offered my reflection a cold, knowing smile, and walked out to Richard's car. The baby shower was held at the Oakbrook Prestige Country Club, a sprawling, massively expensive venue that catered strictly to the elite. As Richard handed his keys to the valet, he whistled cheerfully, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He walked through the grand double doors with the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he was practically invincible. I followed silently a few steps behind him. We entered the main ballroom, and the sheer, staggering audacity of the event hit me like a physical wave. The massive room had been transformed into a sickeningly lavish pastel wonderland. A live string quartet played softly in the corner. Thousands of imported white roses and orchids cascaded from crystal vases on every single table. In the center of the room sat a mountain of perfectly wrapped gifts, stacked almost to the ceiling. And at the very front of the ballroom, positioned directly beneath a massive projector screen, was a plush velvet throne. Audrey was holding court. She wore a custom form-fitting silk gown that highlighted her perfectly maintained model figure. She held a glass of sparkling cider, laughing brightly as dozens of high society guests lined up to offer their congratulations. She was accepting hugs, kissing cheeks, and gracefully accepting praises as the brave, expecting mother. It was the ultimate narcissistic fantasy. She was receiving all the glory, all the attention, and all the expensive gifts of motherhood without having to endure a single second of the physical reality. My mother, Diana, was hovering right next to her like a proud manager. When Diana spotted me walking into the ballroom, her smile instantly vanished. She quickly marched over, grabbed me by the elbow, and practically dragged me toward the back of the room. She hissed under her breath that I was late, and instructed me to sit at a small table in the far corner, completely out of the sightlines of the main event. She told me to keep my head down, eat my salad, and let Audrey have her moment. I simply nodded, pulled out my chair and sat down in the shadows. From my corner table, I watched the grotesque pantomime unfold. Wealthy women in designer dresses occasionally drifted past my table offering me looks of condescending pity. A few actually stopped to pat my shoulder, telling me I was doing such a beautiful, selfless thing for my sister by acting as her surrogate. I thanked them in a soft whisper, mentally adding their faces to the long list of people who were about to witness the greatest scandal in the history of their country club. Across the room, Richard was in his element. He was standing by the open bar, with a group of wealthy investors holding a glass of expensive scotch and laughing loudly. He was boasting about a massive influx of capital he had recently secured for his retirement portfolio, entirely oblivious to the fact that his bank accounts were currently frozen, and federal agents were likely already staging their vehicles outside the venue's wrought iron gates. Then I saw Andre. He was standing near the towering pile of gifts, looking immaculate in a dark charcoal suit. But unlike Richard, Andre was not laughing. He held a glass of water, his posture rigid and his dark eyes sweeping over the crowd with a cold, terrifying calculation. He watched Audrey unwrap a sterling silver baby, rattle, his jaw clenched so tightly I could almost see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. For a fraction of a second, his eyes met mine across the crowded ballroom. He gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. The locks were in place. The traps were fully set. An hour into the event, the string quartet stopped playing. The low murmur of wealthy guests chatting and laughing began to quiet down as my mother tapped a silver spoon against her crystal glass. She proudly announced that it was time for the gift presentation and the special family toast. Audrey gracefully took her seat on the velvet throne, beaming at her audience. Richard stepped up to the microphone stand positioned right next to the massive projector screen, a smug, triumphant grin plastered across his face. The venue staff began to dim the grand chandeliers. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, plunging the ballroom into a soft, cinematic darkness. The projector mounted on the ceiling hummed to life, casting a bright white square onto the screen behind Richard. I remained seated at my dark table in the back corner of the room. I slowly reached my right hand into the deep pocket of my oversized beige dress. My fingers wrapped tightly around a small black remote control. I had bribed the country club's audiovisual technician $300 earlier that morning to sync my remote to their primary presentation laptop. As Richard cleared his throat and tapped the microphone to begin his toast, my thumb hovered directly over the play button. The masquerade was officially over. I eased my thumb back from the play button. As a forensic accountant, I knew that the absolute best time to catch a fraudster was right after they had fully committed to their lie on the public record. I wanted Richard to build his pedestal as high as humanly possible before I completely shattered its foundation. I sat back in my uncomfortable wooden chair, hiding in the dim shadows of the ballroom, and allowed my husband to dig his own grave just a little bit deeper. Richard tapped the microphone twice. The sharp thumping sound echoed through the massive country club, instantly commanding the attention of every wealthy guest in the room. He offered a practiced, charming smile that radiated pure executive confidence. He welcomed the country club elite, the corporate partners, and the various family members to what he called the most important day of his and Audrey's lives. His voice was smooth, perfectly modulated, and absolutely dripping with fake sincerity. He was in his element, playing the charismatic leader and the devoted family man with terrifying ease. He turned his body slightly to face the velvet throne where Audrey was sitting. The spotlight caught the sheen of her custom silk gown as she looked up at him with wide, manufactured adoration. Richard spoke about the difficult, agonizing journey they had supposedly endured to reach this moment. He painted a completely fictional picture of their struggle, detailing sleepless nights and tearful conversations about expanding their family. He praised Audrey for her incredible resilience. He actually used the word bravery. He told the room of hundreds of people that it took immense bravery for a woman to accept that her path to motherhood might look different than the traditional route, and that her willingness to embrace alternative methods was a testament to her beautiful, selfless soul. The high society crowd absolutely devoured every single word. Wealthy women in designer dresses sighed collectively. Some reached into their expensive clutches to retrieve tissues to dab at their eyes. My mother Diana stood near the front, beaming with overpowering pride. She nodded vigorously at Richard's words, entirely validating the sickening narrative that Audrey was a modern martyr who had bravely sacrificed her own ego to bring a child into the world. It was a masterpiece of domestic gaslighting executed flawlessly in front of the most influential people in their entire social circle. But Richard was not finished. He gripped the microphone stand, lowered his chin, and let his voice drop into a soft, reverent whisper. He told the quiet ballroom that this miracle would not have been possible without the profound generosity of a very special woman. He spoke about the anonymous surrogate. He called this unnamed woman an absolute angel walking among them. He claimed that she had selflessly volunteered her own body to carry their biological child because she simply wanted to give them the ultimate gift of life. As he delivered this grotesque lie, Richard casually raised his free hand and gestured vaguely toward the dark back corner of the ballroom where I was sitting. He did not say my name. He did not ask the spotlight to shift to my table. He simply kept me relegated to the shadows, an unnamed, faceless incubator dressed in a drab beige gown. He publicly thanked me for being a quiet, obedient vessel for their happiness. The sheer, staggering audacity of his words sent a cold thrill straight down my spine. He was standing in front of federal agents staging outside, stealing millions from the man standing by the gift table, and publicly thanking the wife he had medically raped for facilitating his entire criminal enterprise. Audrey played her part to absolute perfection. She brought a manicured hand to her chest, closed her eyes, and let a single flawless tear roll down her cheek. She mouthed the words "thank you" toward the general direction of the back wall. The room erupted into a thunderous round of applause. The guests were completely mesmerized by the beautiful, wealthy, tragic couple who had overcome adversity to build their perfect family. Richard raised his crystal glass of expensive scotch high into the air. He asked every single person in the massive ballroom to raise their glasses and join him in a toast to Audrey, to the incredible future of their family, and to the beautiful baby that was soon to arrive. Glasses clinked throughout the room, creating a shimmering wave of sound. The masquerade had finally reached its absolute dizzying peak. They were standing at the very top of the world, entirely untouchable in their own minds. I looked over at Andre. He had not raised his glass. He simply stared at Richard, his face an unreadable mask of cold stone. I looked back to the brightly lit stage, took a slow, deep breath, and firmly pressed my thumb down on the remote control. I pressed my thumb firmly down on the black remote control. Above me, the heavy venue projector mounted to the ceiling clicked sharply. The bright, cheerful slideshow of pastel nursery inspirations and generic stock photos of smiling babies instantly vanished. In its place, a stark, glaring white document filled the massive 50-foot screen at the front of the ballroom. The sudden burst of clinical white light completely washed out the warm, romantic ambiance of the room, casting harsh shadows across the elegant floral centerpieces. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished floor, the sound cutting through the stunned silence. I stepped out of the shadows of my back corner table and began to walk down the center aisle. Hundreds of wealthy guests turned in their seats, their expensive jewelry catching the light as they stared at the drab, unassuming woman in the oversized beige dress who was suddenly interrupting the perfect celebration. On the stage, Richard froze. He turned his head to look at the screen behind him. His eyes widened in absolute horror as his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. It was the certified genetic barcode analysis from the Genesis Elite Fertility Center, bearing the bright red official stamps of Dr. Thorne. I walked up the short flight of stairs to the stage. Richard was completely paralyzed. His charismatic, charming facade shattered into a million pieces. As I stepped right next to him, he finally snapped out of his trance. He leaned in, his face pale and sweating, and hissed under his breath, demanding to know what I was doing and ordering me to sit back down. I did not acknowledge him. I simply reached out and ripped the microphone straight out of his trembling hand. A sharp, loud whine of audio feedback pierced the room, making several guests wince and cover their ears. I stood at the absolute center of the stage, towering over the crowd, and looked directly down at Audrey. She was frozen on her plush velvet throne, her crystal glass of cider trembling violently in her hand. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the massive ballroom, cold, precise, and entirely devoid of emotion. I told the room to read the screen. I announced that I was not an anonymous surrogate. I said the words clearly and deliberately. I am the victim of medical rape by my husband and my sister. The silence that fell over the country club was absolute and suffocating. It was a heavy, terrifying vacuum of sound. No one breathed. No one moved. My mother Diana, who was standing just a few feet away from the stage, dropped her champagne flute. It shattered against the hardwood floor, the delicate crystal exploding outward. But she did not even blink. She just stared at me, her mouth hanging open in shock. I clicked the remote control a second time. The massive screen transitioned to the next piece of evidence. It displayed a high-resolution scan of the gestational surrogacy consent form. I pointed up at the screen. I explained to the hundreds of horrified guests that the signature at the bottom of that document was a complete forgery executed by the man standing right next to me. I looked out at the sea of faces and systematically dismantled their beautiful fairy tale. I explained that the child currently growing inside my body was not a miracle of modern medicine. It was a product of deceit. I revealed that the embryo was created using Richard's sperm and Audrey's harvested egg. I told them that my husband had exploited my demanding work schedule to secretly orchestrate this procedure, bypassing strict federal medical regulations, to implant my sister's biological child into my uterus, without my knowledge or consent. I turned my gaze back to Audrey. The color had completely drained from her perfect face. She looked like a terrified, trapped animal. I stripped away her carefully crafted martyr narrative piece by piece. I spoke into the microphone, telling the entire high society crowd that Audrey was not a brave woman making a difficult sacrifice. She was simply a vain, selfish adulterer who had been sleeping with my husband for over a year. I told them she was too obsessed with keeping her perfect modeling figure to carry her own child, so she and Richard decided to turn me into a free, unwitting incubator. The crowd finally began to react. It started as a low, horrified murmur and quickly escalated into gasps of pure revulsion. Wealthy women who had just been crying tears of joy for Audrey were now staring at her with absolute disgust. I saw dozens of cell phones being raised into the air, their camera lenses recording every single second of the destruction. Richard lunged forward. His face was contorted in sheer panic and rage. He reached out to grab the microphone from my hand, desperately shouting to the crowd that I was having a mental breakdown and that the pregnancy hormones were making me crazy. But he was far too late. The undeniable, legally certified documents glowing on the screen behind him completely destroyed his lies. The gaslighting was dead, and the truth was now entirely out of their control. Richard lunged forward, his face twisted into an ugly mask of sheer panic and desperation, but I simply stepped out of his reach. He tripped over the thick microphone cord, stumbling awkwardly and falling hard against the polished wooden floor of the stage. Before he could scramble back to his feet, I pressed the final button on my remote control. The massive surround sound speakers of the country club, usually reserved for light string quartets and elegant announcements, suddenly crackled with sharp, undeniable audio. It was the digital recording I had captured from the downtown hotel bar just days earlier. Richard's arrogant, intoxicated voice echoed over the hundreds of guests, boasting about how perfectly he had manipulated his naive accountant wife. The entire ballroom froze. Whatever tiny fraction of doubt remained in the room was instantly vaporized by the sound of Audrey's high-pitched, grating laugh blaring from the speakers. The recording was pristine. Everyone heard Audrey mocking my total compliance, calling me an obedient dog who had finally learned her place. They heard Richard bragging about the illegal postnuptial agreement, laughing about how the $5 million financial penalty had completely paralyzed my analytical brain. The wealthy women in the front row, the very same women who had been wiping away tears of joy just 5 minutes ago, now clamped their hands over their mouths in absolute horror. But the domestic cruelty was only the beginning. I stood silently on the stage and let the audio feed continue straight into their massive financial conspiracy. The crowd listened in dead silence as Richard explicitly detailed his plan to execute the final wire transfer from Andre's commercial development account. They heard Audrey complain about her hard-working husband calling Andre a gullible workhorse whose only purpose was to fund their offshore trust. They heard the clinking of martini glasses as Richard laughingly toasted to Andre being a useful idiot. Pandemonium erupted. It was not a slow, gradual build of tension. It was an instantaneous explosion of absolute chaos. The polite, restrained etiquette of the country club completely disintegrated in a matter of seconds. People began shouting over the audio. Chairs scraped violently against the hardwood floor as guests pushed themselves away from the beautifully decorated tables, acting as if the room itself had suddenly caught fire. Dozens of cell phones were thrust high into the air, camera lenses focused dead ahead, flashes going off in rapid succession. The elite social circles of Chicago were no longer just witnessing a messy family scandal. They were actively documenting a massive federal crime in real time. The flawless pastel baby shower had officially become a live-streamed crime scene. From the chaos below the stage, a loud, hysterical scream pierced the air. My mother Diana finally snapped out of her stunned paralysis. Her perfectly manicured high society facade crumbled entirely. She scrambled up the side steps of the stage, her expensive heels slipping wildly on the wood. She completely ignored the horrifying truths blaring from the speakers, her toxic favoritism blinding her to the reality of what her golden child had actually done. She lunged frantically toward the audio-visual cart positioned behind the projector screen. She began grabbing at the thick black power cables, ripping them violently from their sockets in a desperate, pathetic attempt to cut the power. The massive screen flashed blue, and the audio finally cut out with a loud electronic pop, but the silence did not return to the ballroom. Diana spun around to face the crowd, her hair disheveled, her eyes completely wild with panic. She pointed a shaking finger at me and began screaming at the top of her lungs. She yelled that I was a pathological liar, that I had always been insanely jealous of my beautiful sister, and that the medical documents and audio recordings were completely fabricated. She desperately ordered the guests to put their phones away and demanded that the venue staff call security to remove me from the premises immediately, but absolutely no one listened to her. The damage was total and entirely irrevocable. The crowd did not look at her and see a protective, loving mother. They saw a delusional enabler trying to cover up the actions of two sociopaths. Several of the wealthy corporate investors Richard had been boasting to by the bar were already on their phones, undoubtedly calling their own legal teams to sever all financial ties with his consulting firm before the fallout hit the news. Audrey remained glued to her plush velvet throne, her face buried in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the camera flashes illuminated her custom silk gown. Her entire high society kingdom had burned to the ground in less than 3 minutes. I stood calmly on the edge of the stage, the microphone resting easily at my side. I did not need to shout over my mother's hysterical screaming or the chaotic roar of the crowd. I looked down at Richard, who was still kneeling on the floor, staring blankly at the disconnected projector. The arrogant, untouchable mastermind was gone. I had promised Andre that we would push them off the cliff at the very peak of their delusion, and the fall was absolutely devastating. Richard's shock finally broke violently, replaced by pure, unadulterated rage. Seeing me standing so calmly on the stage, entirely unharmed by the inferno I had just ignited, snapped whatever fragile thread of sanity he had left. He realized in a fraction of a second that his perfect, wealthy future was entirely gone. He scrambled up from his knees with a guttural, terrifying scream. His hands curled into tight fists as he lunged violently toward the edge of the stage, fully intending to drag me down to the floor. But he never even made it within 3 feet of me. Before I could even take a step back, a tall, imposing figure moved seamlessly out of the chaotic crowd. Andre intercepted Richard with a terrifying silent speed. He did not shout a warning. He did not hesitate. Andre simply planted his feet, pulled back his arm, and delivered a single devastating punch directly to the side of Richard's jaw. The sickening hollow crack of bone against bone echoed sharply like a gunshot, cutting straight through the ambient panic of the ballroom. The sheer force of the blow lifted Richard entirely off his feet. He crashed hard against the polished hardwood floor, sliding slightly before coming to a dead stop. He was instantly neutralized, groaning in a dazed heap, spitting a bright streak of blood onto the collar of his crisp white dress shirt. Andre stood over the man who had pretended to be his best friend. He calmly adjusted the cuffs of his dark charcoal suit, his breathing perfectly steady and controlled. He looked down at Richard with a gaze so dark and incredibly cold, it could have frozen the entire room. He told Richard to stay exactly where he was, warning him that if he tried to get up again, the next hit would do permanent damage. The surrounding high society guests immediately backed away, giving Andre a wide, highly respectful berth. Nobody dared to intervene. The wealthy corporate investors who had been drinking expensive scotch with Richard just moments ago now watched him bleed on the floor with expressions of absolute disgust and complete detachment. Without another word to the man bleeding at his feet, Andre stepped directly over Richard's prone body. He turned his attention to the front of the room and began walking a slow, highly methodical path toward the plush velvet throne. Audrey was still cowering there, completely surrounded by a towering mountain of incredibly expensive baby gifts. As Andre approached, the crowd parted for him like the sea. My mother, still reeling from her hysterical outburst, tried to step into his path. She raised her hands frantically, trying to protect her golden child, but Andre did not even break his stride. He looked right through Diana, his massive presence forcing her to stumble awkwardly backward out of his way. Andre stopped right in front of Audrey. She shrank back against the velvet cushions, her perfect face twisted in sheer, unadulterated terror. She looked up at him, her chest heaving as she desperately tried to summon the manipulative, innocent tears that had always saved her from facing any real consequences. She reached a trembling, manicured hand out toward him, whispering his name, begging him to please listen to her. She immediately tried to throw Richard under the bus, crying that he had forced her into it and that she was completely innocent. Andre did not reach back. He did not show a single ounce of pity. Instead, he calmly unbuttoned his suit jacket, reached into the inner breast pocket, and pulled out a thick, heavily folded stack of official papers. It was the complete, undeniable compilation of the FBI financial wiretap logs, the offshore banking transfers, and the Cayman Islands Trust Fund charter bearing her name. He held the thick stack in the air for a heavy second before letting it drop. The documents hit the floor right at her feet, scattering heavily across the imported white roses and the silver baby rattles. He looked down at the woman he had loved and delivered the final crushing blow. "You did not just steal my heart, Audrey," he said, his deep voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. "You stole $1.5 million, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation does not take that lightly." Audrey stared down at the federal documents resting on her designer shoes. She scrambled desperately to pick them up, her eyes frantically scanning the highlighted routing numbers and her own signature on the offshore trust charter. She began to hyperventilate, shaking her head wildly as the inescapable reality of her situation crushed her. She grabbed at Andre's pant leg, sobbing hysterically. Andre gently but firmly kicked her hand away. He leaned down slightly, his voice completely stripped of any warmth. He told her not to insult his intelligence with fake tears. He informed her that as of this very morning, her access to his personal and corporate accounts was permanently terminated. He revealed that his legal team had already filed emergency divorce papers, and the locks on their suburban estate had been completely changed. She was officially locked out, utterly destitute and entirely alone. The trap had snapped shut and she had absolutely nowhere left to run. Before Audrey could even process Andre's words, the heavy oak doors at the back of the country club ballroom swung open with a resounding crash. A team of federal agents dressed in dark windbreakers with the FBI acronym emblazoned across their backs marched into the room, flanked by multiple uniformed local police officers. Their heavy boots echoed against the hardwood floor, instantly silencing the remaining murmurs of the wealthy guests. They moved with a terrifying practiced precision, completely ignoring the lavish floral arrangements, the live string quartet instruments abandoned in the corner, and the horrified gasps of the Chicago elite. The lead federal agent, a tall woman with a completely unreadable expression, held up a thick folder of official arrest warrants. Two agents marched directly to the side of the stage where Richard was still groaning on the floor. They did not offer him a hand to help him up politely. They grabbed him by the shoulders of his expensive tailored suit and hauled him roughly to his feet. The lead agent stood firmly in front of him, loudly declaring his name for the entire room to hear. She stated that Richard was being placed under federal arrest. As she read him his Miranda rights, she listed the charges with a loud, ringing clarity that cut through the silence. Aggravated identity theft, medical battery, interstate wire fraud, and massive corporate embezzlement. Richard tried to stammer a defense, his bleeding jaw making his words slur pathetically, but an agent simply spun him around and slammed his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed fiercely through the ballroom. Across the room, two more agents approached the velvet throne. Audrey pressed herself as far back into the plush cushions as physically possible, shaking her head in violent, frantic denial. She looked at the stoic agents, then desperately at the wealthy women in the crowd begging someone to intervene. She cried out that she was a respected high society mother, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, and that her husband was a wealthy architect who would sue them all. The agents remained entirely unfazed by her hysterical entitlement. They reached down, grabbed her by the arms, and pulled her off the throne. Audrey screamed and thrashed, her custom silk gown tearing slightly at the side seam as she fought them, but her resistance was entirely useless. They forced her hands behind her back, locking the cold steel cuffs directly over her expensive silk sleeves. The agent clearly announced her charges of conspiracy to commit wire fraud and international money laundering. Seeing her precious golden child being forcefully restrained by federal law enforcement completely shattered my mother's mind. Diana let out a high-pitched, agonizing wail that sounded like a wounded animal. She threw herself onto the polished hardwood floor, crawling desperately toward the agents holding Audrey. She grabbed at the lead agent's pant leg, sobbing hysterically and screaming that they were making a colossal mistake. She cried out that Audrey was a good girl, her beautiful golden child, and that I was the evil, jealous sister who had orchestrated this entire nightmare out of pure spite. A local police officer, gently but firmly, peeled Diana off the federal agent, restraining her against a banquet table as she continued to thrash and scream. Diana collapsed against the pristine white tablecloth, sobbing uncontrollably as she watched her perfect family fantasy dissolve into a nightmare of federal charges. The agents began the long walk out of the ballroom. Richard went first, his head hanging low, his face bruised and bleeding, completely stripped of his arrogant executive swagger. The wealthy corporate investors he had been trying to impress just an hour ago physically turned their backs on him as he passed. Then came Audrey. She was dragged down the center aisle, her flawless makeup completely ruined by her hysterical tears, her designer shoes stumbling awkwardly over the hem of her torn silk gown. The high society guests did not look away out of polite respect. They held up their phones, recording every single humiliating second of her perp walk. The woman who had spent her entire life judging others for not meeting her flawless aesthetic standards was now being paraded in handcuffs through her own lavish baby shower, entirely humiliated in front of her entire social circle. I stood on the stage watching the heavy oak doors close behind them. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers parked outside washed through the tall ballroom windows, illuminating the stunned faces of the remaining guests. The venue staff stood frozen against the walls. The towering pile of expensive baby gifts sitting next to the empty velvet throne suddenly looked like a pathetic monument to their incredible greed. Andre walked slowly over to the stage and stood beside me. We simply watched the police cruisers pull away from the country club, carrying the toxic ruins of our previous lives with them. The trap had worked flawlessly, executing a perfect, undeniable justice. 6 months have passed since the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the pristine windows of the Oakbrook Prestige Country Club. The federal justice system moves slowly, but when it is handed an ironclad, mathematically perfect case of wire fraud and medical battery, it moves with absolute and terrifying certainty. I sat in the polished wooden gallery of the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago, wearing a sharp, tailored suit, and watched the final consequences of their arrogance unfold. Richard stood before the federal judge, looking completely unrecognizable. The charming, immaculately dressed executive who had once bragged about his massive offshore portfolios was gone. He wore a drab, oversized orange jumpsuit that swallowed his frame. His shoulders were slumped and his face was pale and gaunt. The judge did not show a single ounce of leniency. He admonished Richard for his breathtaking greed and his sociopathic manipulation of both the financial markets and his own family. When the gavel finally fell, Richard was sentenced to 8 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, without the possibility of early parole. He did not look back at me as the marshals escorted him out of the courtroom. Audrey faced her own reckoning shortly after. Her high-powered defense attorneys, completely paid for by our mother, who had drained her own retirement savings to hire them, tried to paint Audrey as a naive victim of Richard's manipulation. But the audio recordings I had captured at the hotel bar completely destroyed that narrative. The judge heard her mocking Andre, plotting to bankrupt his firm, and eagerly anticipating her stolen millions. Audrey was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Furthermore, Andre's ruthless corporate lawyers had completely dismantled her in the divorce proceedings. She lost the suburban estate, the luxury cars, and any claim to his architectural fortune. She walked into prison with absolutely nothing to her name. My mother, entirely bankrupted by the legal fees, and thoroughly exiled from her elite social circles, was forced to sell her sprawling colonial home and move into a tiny, isolated apartment entirely alone. As for the Genesis Elite Fertility Center, they did not even attempt to fight my civil lawsuit. The sheer magnitude of their gross negligence and the undeniable proof of Dr. Thorne's official medical records left them completely defenseless. To avoid a highly publicized trial that would permanently destroy their global brand, the clinic's board of directors agreed to an immediate, massive settlement. I walked away with $12 million tax-free, transferred securely into a heavily encrypted account that only I controlled. The most complicated chapter of this nightmare concluded exactly 1 month after the sentencing. I delivered the baby in a quiet, private hospital wing. I did not look at the child. I did not want to see Richard's blue eyes or Audrey's features, but I made absolutely certain the baby was safe. Andre was waiting in the hallway. He had filed extensive legal paperwork, completely bypassing the standard foster system to formally adopt the child the absolute second it was born. Because the embryo was implanted illegally and without my consent, the family court judge easily granted the petition, completely severing all my legal, financial, and biological ties to the infant. Andre took the baby into his arms, his dark eyes filled with genuine, unconditional love. He promised me he would raise the child far away from the toxicity of our family, and I knew he would keep that promise. We hugged warmly, 2 survivors who had successfully protected each other, and went our separate ways. Today, I am 34 years old, incredibly wealthy, and fundamentally free. I used a portion of my massive settlement to lease a beautiful penthouse office overlooking the Chicago skyline. I officially opened my own elite forensic accounting firm. I do not audit massive faceless corporations anymore. I specialize exclusively in high-stakes divorces, helping vulnerable women trace hidden assets and escape financially abusive marriages. I use the exact same predatory tracking software I used to destroy Richard to dismantle other arrogant men who think they can hide their money in the dark. As I stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office holding a cup of hot coffee and watching the city move below me, I feel a profound sense of peace. You are never truly trapped, even when your own family builds the cage. The truth is always buried somewhere in the ledger, waiting for someone brave enough to find it. Have you ever discovered a betrayal hiding in plain sight? Share your story in the comments below. If this journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and justice. Remember, no matter how dark the deception gets, you always have the power to audit your own life and rewrite the bottom line. The harrowing journey of discovering such a profound betrayal from those who are supposed to protect you teaches a devastating but ultimately empowering lesson. It reveals that our true strength does not lie in preventing the cruelty of others, but in how we choose to respond when the illusion of safety shatters. When faced with a toxic environment, the natural human instinct is often to shrink, to internalize the blame, or to succumb to the crushing weight of victimhood. The family dynamics in this story expected absolute submission, relying on the arrogant assumption that a betrayed woman would be too paralyzed by emotional manipulation to fight back. However, the core lesson here is that you do not have to accept the narrative that toxic people write for you. By stepping back, detaching from the immediate emotional devastation, and assessing the reality of the situation with cold analytical clarity, you can immediately reclaim your agency. Furthermore, this story serves as a powerful reminder that boundaries are absolutely essential for survival. Blood relations and marital vows are meaningless if they are used merely as weapons of exploitation. True family is built on mutual respect and safety, not convenience or control. The ultimate victory is never just about exposing the truth or seeking revenge against those who wronged you. The greatest triumph is in finally walking away from a toxic cage to build a life where you are completely, unapologetically independent. We cannot always control the deceit of those around us, but we hold the absolute power to cut our losses and start anew. If you have ever felt trapped by the betrayals of those closest to you, take a moment today to audit your own relationships, draw your boundaries, and start reclaiming the power that rightfully belongs to you.